Marxist theorist. He was a philosopher and a sociologist, and was generally speaking accepted because he was a member of the Communist Party. But after the war, around 1948, 47, 48, when the Cold War heated up, Lefebvre was on the wrong side. This book had already been written in 1939. The last reading that we will do will be the most recent book that has been translated by Theodor Wiesengrund Adorno, who has mistakenly, not by me, but mistakenly been dubbed by dogmatic Marxism a betrayer of Marxism, some kind of philosopher that's outside of the scope of Marx's philosophy and theory of society. It never was true, but particularly in this book, which is called Introduction to the Dialectic, it is completely false. 1958, this guy is 55 years old, and he delivers 20 lectures. On dialectics. Now, why dialectics is particularly difficult is because it is not a content. It can be articulated with content, which it must be in order to be alive, but it is not a content. By which I mean it is a way of thinking, which Adorno will, and Lukács also, and Lefebvre all believe have been confused with extra scientific thought. They all believe that historical materialism and dialectical materialism, in the case of Lefebvre, is science, and they think science is problematic, which is a iconoclastic, even scandalous view when it comes to most social theory, which likes to think of itself as scientific, which means that it follows the element, what he calls, Lefebvre calls, the primitive idea of cause and effect. Can you actually give us an example of what cause and effect, an example of cause and effect?
Water
you all
boiling?
have it on the tip of your tongue.
Water boiling?
Well,
You put up the flame?
Yeah, but that's too...
Yeah, I know.
No. What's the one that you'll find in the newspapers each and every day? And on television and radio very often, and certainly widely used.
Isn't the billiard ball example given?
Yes. It's the billiard ball theory of causality. Well, but give me, how does it work? What's an example?
So US dropped the atomic bomb.
I'm sorry?
US dropped the atomic bomb and it caused the end of World War II.
Uh-huh. But what's a commonplace idea of this, which makes it very difficult to refute?
The physical dynamics of motion?
No, get more basic, Beth. It's much more basic.
That there's a single cause and a single effect.
A single cause and a single effect. So-and-so died on Monday of cancer.
It's not a single cause, single effect.
Well, that's the way it's understood. So-and-so died on Tuesday of pneumonia. So-and-so is a genius because he or she has an IQ which is above X, usually 160 IQ. Cause and effect. Dialectics is a causality which wants to take into account the multiplicity of influences, none of which singly would produce a result. Including most illnesses, why would the idea that cancer causes a death be a billiard-ball theory? Can you think about that?
Well, for one thing, this other person had the same cancer but didn't die. I mean, what about the person contributed to the death?
David, I think that's probably the simplest but not simplistic explanation of what dialectics differs from traditional science. First, it seeks to explain why that person and not that person contracts cancer, or both contracted cancer. One died of the same cancer and the other didn't. That's a very complicated problem. 16% of all those who have lung cancer survive, which means that 84% of those who have lung cancer die of lung cancer. But we don't know why that 84 and 16 divide by the ways in which science operates. They take for granted that it's all a matter of chance, and rarely, if ever, try to find out what the specific factors are which enable some people to overcome cancer, heart disease, pneumonia, or whatever, and other people cannot do that. If it was a matter of the quality of treatment, given the scientific norms of our time, that thesis would break down, because some of the richest people with access to the so-called best medical facilities drop when they get things like lung cancer or pancreatic cancer, which is even worse, 95%, and some people might even have cancer. So that the dialectical project is always to ask the question beneath the answer. Why X and not Y? Why X and not Y? What are the multiplicity of factors which may account for some result? And the word may account would be much more accurate than does account. But may account probably is a better explanation that so-and-so died of cancer. Natural causes. So-and-so died of natural causes. What does that mean?
Means they were old enough that they don't have to provide a cause.
That's right.
Usually, really, if you're
Once you
over
get to be, no, it'd be much younger, but once you get to be now about 75 years, they don't need to account for when announcing it. It is easy. Lucas with as and dialectics, which is a complex and he starts dialectics and they're not simple. It's not simple platonism. The question arises to you as a result of the meeting. And we'll start every session that way. And if there are no questions, I will assume that you haven't done the reading carefully.
Or you can move the lift.
And you won't read the fact
You won't
carefully.
move that carefully either.
That's assuming a single cause and effect.
Excuse me.
That's using a single cause and effect, and
Right.
that's what.
Good.
Very good.
But if I say you haven't read it carefully, it means I'm saying you better read it 3 times before you purport to understand it. And that means it won't be even this time that you've read it.
On page 4.
Page what?
Page 4.
It's
4.
not my page 4, but it's all right.
Oh,
Is
in
it
the
my
book.
page? No.
Yeah, you have the same thing.
What?
Yeah, you have the same pagination.
Yeah?
Yeah, it's the same pagination.
All right. Page 4.
It begins with forming fluid at the top?
Yes, at the
Okay.
top. And then you go down 1, 2, 3, 4. The 9th line down
You
talks
want to go
about
from the
Mach.
top?
Yes, sir. Yes, comrade. Sorry.
Much better, Tibby. You're gonna, you know.
And go to
You have to,
the
you've been go around the boss too long, you know.
Read it.
Now it's talking about volunteerism and fatalism, and the first thing that came to mind was Narodная воля. You know, when the people would go out to the people. There was Kropotkin belonged to this little group of disempowered royalty in Russia, and they would go out to the people and convert them to socialism
Would you
or
read
something.
it, please?
Oh, this thing. That Marxism can also give birth to an equally bourgeois volunteerism. Does not contradict this. Fatalism and volunteerism are only mutually contradictory to an undialectical and unhistorical mind. I don't understand it. What's his definition of volunteerism?
Yeah. What is that? But it's not his definition in this case. It is a common understanding of what volunteerism is.
Wishing will make it so.
Huh?
Wishing will make it so.
Well, no. Yeah. Chris?
No, I don't know. It's a good question.
Good question.
I know what fatalism is.
Give an example of volunteerism. Anybody? You all know it. All of you. Not a single exception except Archer.
So like
Not a
the,
single exception.
so like
Because of the young pioneers, that's
good.
why,
That's
that's why.
the phrase "there's a will, there's a way." If there's a will, there's a way.
If there's a will, there's a way is as good as any.
Right.
And here, and that's one version of it. And the second version is that if the revolutionary organization is sufficiently well organized and has a broad enough base in the masses, namely in the working class, revolution is possible and eventually will occur. But the dependent variable there is the revolutionary organization's ability to grow. But growth itself is held a fundamental cause of change. Revolutionary, radical, whatever you want, for the moment.
Is it similar to agency?
Yeah, so what about it?
No, I'm asking if it's similar to agency.
Yeah, but agency is a lot more squishy. Volunteerism believes that change is a matter of will, and that will has some steps to it, but it's pretty clear that if you have a mass party, political organization, or mass social movement, you will inevitably affect basic change. Unless, at the top, we have renegades, like Lenin's renegade Kautsky, who was, by the way, a volunteerist in many respects, not Kautsky, Lenin. He has other areas that he's not a volunteerist, but in that area he is. Here's another more complex example. Germany was defeated by 1918. There was an armistice that was signed. At that point, the Social Democratic Party, before the organization of the Communist Party, the Social Democratic Party was a mass party with support, overwhelming support of the working class, including the returning veterans. That it did not choose, given the defeat and the virtual collapse of the German economy at that time, that it did not choose to take revolutionary action as a sign that it had no will to revolutionary action and was in fact on the road to betrayal of the class and of the poor to represent. That's a fairly complicated sentence, but it is an example of volunteerism.
What about Rosa in 1918?
What?
What about 1918
That's
and
what I was
Liebknecht
talking
and
about.
Rosa?
That's what I was talking about.
Well, they tried.
Rosa Luxemburg doesn't have to be, because she was a great figure, doesn't have to be exempt from volunteerism either. To blame the leadership is a very, very good example of volunteerism. Yes.
Well, I mean, I'm confused. So you're saying that, I guess Lenin is an example of volunteerism, but I think, yeah, okay, but basically, Lukács is writing his Marxism can also give birth to an equally bourgeois volunteerism.
Yeah.
So he seems to be identifying volunteerism as something that's bourgeois.
Well,
that
it doesn't,
certainly isn't
because
Lenin.
it's Lenin, that doesn't mean that it doesn't have any bourgeois elements, does it?
But do you think he has Lenin in mind when he says this?
What did you say?
think he has
There's
Lenin in
Marx
mind when he
science
makes
in mind,
this?
doesn't
Yeah, I don't think he has Lenin in mind
There's
when he
Marx
makes
in
this
mind.
comment.
I think he had Lenin in mind,
Yeah.
yes. I think for that reason he was told, stop this crap or else you're expelled. Two guys. One was Lukács, and the other, whose history and class consciousness was for the Communist Party a scandal and a betrayal.
Yeah.
And the other one was Korsch, Korsch, whose book Marxism and Philosophy was regarded equally as a retrograde bourgeois book. There's an antinomy to volunteerism. Determinism. The antinomy is not an opposition which is disconnected. Antinomies are usually linked to one another by their contrast. The antinomy is that given certain circumstances, the determinism is, given certain circumstances, a revolutionary situation will arise. The smart determinists will say whether they take advantage of it, whether the CP or the socialists or the labor movement takes advantage of it and moves towards revolutionary action, depends on a bunch of factors, but mainly on the leadership's will to step outside of the given circumstances. It follows that even in lesser situations, you will find that in the labor movement, there are workers, employees, if they're professionals, who have all of the ideas of wanting to change their situation by choosing, in the United States at least, choosing to join the union or to build a union out of a non-union situation, but don't do it because they don't want to risk their jobs. That's an example of volunteerism. And then there are those who put their jobs on the line willingly, even if with a lot of sweat and trepidation, because they know that there will be no progress, as Frederick Douglass has said, without struggle. And they want to be, they don't want to be necessarily in the vanguard, but they want to be, if they have to be in the vanguard and it risks their jobs, they're willing to do it. The step from powerlessness to power is not gradual. It is a sudden, unexpected event in most cases. People don't harbor, they harbor feelings, but they don't take risks constantly. Many people who are found at the helm of union organizing, or black figures who are on the, who take the movement seriously enough to risk their lives, come out of the woodwork. One example of that, I'm sure you are aware of the example, whether you're aware that this situation was the case, was somebody called Martin Luther King in Montgomery, Alabama, not a leader of the civil rights movement at the time of 1954-55. He was persuaded by other ministers to take the lead because of his youth, his attractiveness, and his ability to articulate ideas in ways that could be persuasive both to masses and persuasive to the press. Korsch, Lukács's contemporary and friend, was willing to take the risk of expulsion, even from the university potentially, by refusing to renounce his book, Marxism and Philosophy, which is an excoriating critique of the Leninist-led Third International. Even though he himself was a deputy, communist deputy to the German Parliament, and would have been a likely top leader because he was not only an intellectual, but he was He was an activist. So what else about this book, about this chapter? That's it? Yes.
So,
Page?
page 14. So I think Lukáš is sort of addressing the idea of, let's see, understanding the need for a dialectical conception of totality, which can enable us to understand reality as a social process. But at the first full paragraph on 14, so he's talking.
Only when?
Yes, only when this veil is torn aside does historical knowledge become possible. But the part that I wanted to move down to was the next, not the next, but the following sentence. The knowledge of the real, objective nature of a phenomenon, the knowledge of its historical character, and the knowledge of its actual function in the totality of society form, therefore, a single undivided act of cognition. This unity is shattered by the pseudoscientific method. I guess I was just curious about the participation of the knower in the process too. Kind of thinking about who the knower is, this idea of, and I guess maybe I'm just struggling with this subject-object binary that's still useful in this conversation, but is there any is this an act process knower? I understand this idea of consciousness, the proletariat becoming conscious of self, that's where the unity of subject-object comes into play. Mm-hmm. But is this, it still feels very passive to me in some way. It's deeply political and economic, but I'm wondering if any knower is. Maybe it's my ontological.
But the assumption in Marxist theory is that the knower has two heads, workers and intellectuals.
Okay.
Both are not those who will count in this situation.
Okay.
But the problem are you asking about the position, the role of the knower in relationship to the known?
I think that's part of what I'm asking about, although I'm also concerned about what you're referring to, which is that Marx seems to focus on the proletariat's unity of the subject and object position, but anybody could be unified in the subject and object position too, which would be the elite class.
And I'll come up with bourgeois, according to this thinking,
Mm-hmm.
I'll come up with bourgeois answers.
Mm-hmm.
For example, John Dewey has written a book, co-authored a book called The Knower and the Known.
Oh, I haven't read that. Who's the other author?
Sorry?
Who's the other author?
Does it have another author?
I have to remember who the other author is.
I'll look that up though. That sounds interesting.
I'll look it up. I have it in my library at home. I haven't looked at it for a while.
Mm-hmm.
But of course the knower is not a class of people. The knower is anyone.
Right.
But it was Dewey among the non-Marxist philosophers who first enunciated in any kind of articulated way that the grasp of the thing and the thing itself constitute a unity.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And are not either epistemologically nor ontologically separate. What do I mean? They're not two separate beings.
Mm-hmm.
Knowledge is itself a category of both the knower and the known. And the knower in this case, most cases, in this instance would be human beings, is part of the known. That is part of nature. Adorno used to say openly in his lectures as well as in several places that he wrote, he says, I've always considered myself a part of nature. Therefore, to know is never impossible. It's always a question of ideological presupposition. People don't refuse to learn because they articulate in most cases, I don't want to learn that. They usually say, I already know most of it, why should I read it anymore? And so the ideological question becomes the central question because it's I said supposition, it's the predisposition to what Lukács calls dogmatism that prevents people from learning. And then the next question is, what is it that prevents people from learning? What is it that makes people dogmatists? That's a very good question, which we can't entirely answer today. But it is an important question. It calls for both a historical theory. Marx once said, we only know of one science, the science of history, but it calls for a psychology. And to a large extent, Marxist attempts to develop a psychology have fallen into two pits. One of them is psychoanalysis, which may not necessarily be wrong, but it is not original. And the other is empirical psychology, that is counting things and analyzing things in terms of categories that science has developed of rationality. That's why I think to read Levin's and Lamontian's masterpiece, Dialectical Biologist, the Dialectical Biologist, is a necessary ingredient of any full understanding of dialectics, because it tries to deal with this at the level below, so to speak, human relations, social relations. As I said before, Levins himself was a marine biologist, studied fish and marine animals. And they try to deal with this. Anything else? Never mind my question, what struck you was it as important that we should know in this chapter? I want to call attention to something that you might have missed or overlooked or taken for granted. You took it for granted, it means you thought about it a lot. Page 5, beginning with section 2, we are now faced with the question of the methodological implications of these so-called facts that are idolized throughout the whole of revisionist literature. We'll get back to revisionism in a minute. To what extent may we look to them to provide guidelines for the actions of the revolutionary proletariat? It goes without saying that all knowledge starts from the facts. The only question is, which of the data of life are relevant to knowledge, that and in the context of which method? The only question is, which of the data of life are relevant to knowledge and in the context of which method? He's on his way to making that point and another point, which is important as well, but I wanted to ask what you think of that. Yes.
Isn't that like the definition of science? We start from the facts.
Which ones? Exactly, right?
Proven facts.
Proven facts. By what method?
The scientific method.
Right.
Experiment.
Yes, but
And many times corroborated.
Measurable.
Measurable.
And repeatable.
And repeatable. Not just observable. Replicable.
and Popper says falsifiable. If you can falsify a scientific proposition, says Popper, it's not a scientific proposition. You got to be able to falsify it.
That's sociology.
No,
They,
it's
they,
not.
they make the questionnaire
that's not sociology.
match the conclusion. So you get your
Not
grant.
sociology.
Yeah.
No. Falsifiability does not mean it's false. It means that it can be falsified
Questionable.
if you follow certain procedures. The bottom line is that when you say that history and the historical is the foundation of any possible knowledge that can be at all considered relevant, as he calls it, you must discard the notion that when you isolate, and he uses that word too, when you isolate the object from its context and conduct experiments deliberately, excluding certain facts and including others without explaining why, you're gonna get something which is profoundly problematic. But that's exactly what science does.
And he also claims that it's therefore ideological as well.
That's right. You always have to, and that would go for physics, chemistry, biology, psychology, sociology as well.
Mm-hmm. But there's a problem with history, and I hate to say it, because
sure.
of who writes history.
But that's the whole point. Yeah. It's the standpoint problem.
And they're not the people who make history.
No, he gets to it.
So it's falsified
Yeah. Well, but
by a point of view.
point of view,
Yes.
identification, sure.
Yeah. So
For it is without. Well, let me just expound. There's a very important book of working class history, of English working class history, that is read not only by historians, but it came out in 1964. It's read by almost all. It was read by almost all intellectuals on the left and activists as well. It was a book by Edward Thompson called The Making of the English Working Class. It's about the English working class in the 18th and early 19th century, written by an intellectual who took the point of view of the working class to try to trace its formation. And he had a conclusion that many of his followers never drew. Couldn't find it. Couldn't find the working class because it was in constant flux. And what he found was fragments of working class life and activity that finally he had to say in an essay later on was what we know about the history of the working class. The information, the knowledge of that history is not complete enough, but we know that it's not complete because we are looking for a complex of influences. One of the most interesting changes that took place in his thinking was his essay on the origin of the English working class and of English capitalism. What he discovered was that English capitalism does not begin, industrialism does not begin with the cities, but begins in the countryside. So the countryside is almost from the very beginning never simply agrarian, it's agrarian capitalist. And very few people, but there are some, have followed that up and tried to trace that in the United States. What happens in the United States is that most historians of industrialization and of the working class begin with the cities, begin with the mass industries. They don't go back to the agrarian period, which is not capitalist in the most basic sense, because a lot of that activity is subsistence agriculture and trading and exchange. But Thompson discovered, and that's what makes him such an important figure, that you don't necessarily find out what you're looking for, but you have to explore many different areas, and he does. The essay is included in a collection of Thompson's essays, most of which were written after the making of the English working class. What's it called? Common People?
Common people.
Common People,
Common people,
yeah.
right. Followed up by Raymond Williams, The City and the Country,
Yeah.
right? Yeah. And isn't this
Well,
sort
The
of...
City and the Country is based on literature.
Literature, right.
But Thompson was a historian of the traditional kind, who broke from that traditional, because they were all educated by English historians. And another thing that characterizes Marxism is Albert Saboul, S-A-B-O-U-L, a book called The Sans Culotte. And anybody here who speaks and understands, understands French,
The flowing blood?
without shoes,
Without
shoeless.
Oh, sans culotte.
Sans
Yes.
culotte.
I thought you said
Sans
sang or
culotte.
courant.
No, culotte. I said
No,
culotte.
I heard something
Sorry.
else.
Right.
Barefoot.
Without pants.
It's a very interesting. It's written by Saboul. It's not a pamphlet.
That's a book.
It's a book.
Big book.
Big book.
What?
It's a big book.
It's a big book.
Not a
Yeah.
pamphlet.
We, of course, don't. I'm not being derogatory for the sake of being derogatory. We, of course, are way behind. We don't even have, after the passing of William Freeland, who was not well known, he was at the University of California at Santa Cruz. We don't have an agrarian history of the left in the United States. Not a history of the left, but a leftist who writes agrarian history. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, there's Grant McConnell.
Who?
Grant McConnell.
Yeah. Okay, you can point to one person.
Right.
And there were attempts made by non-leftists, such as
Oh,
the
sure.
Southern Agrarians.
That's right.
And of course, Gramsci raised the question of the Southern question.
That's right, of
in the
course.
20s. So,
I
yeah.
think it was a different South.
It was a different South. Yeah. But the Southern question in the United States was the agrarian question in the United States.
Yep.
Allen Tate, and Crow Ransom, the whole Vanderbilt, the fugitives.
In fact, in the United States, between 1934 and 5 and 1950 and beyond, there was a Communist Party presence in rural South. and some of it was among black people. Robin Kelly has written a very important contribution to that history. But the history of the CP among white Southern farmers has not been really written. There've been articles and there've been
Chapters.
what'd you say?
Chapters and
Chapters,
books.
yeah. There's a book on the left and the south, edited by what the hell is his name? But some of those chapters are very helpful. It's called The Left and the South, or something like that. What does revisionism mean in this chapter?
Revision.
And who is Edward Bernstein?
He's a revisionist.
Now we know the answer.
He's a revisionist evolutionist.
What does revisionism mean in connection with historical materialism or not? But I'll accept either one. Essentially, revisionism means the rewriting of history, its meaning, and the future of society. Edward Bernstein, who was a leader of the German Social Democratic Party at the turn of the century, wrote a book called Evolutionary Socialism, which is translated from German into English. And in that book, has anybody ever read that book? It's worth reading. Not because it's true or false, but because it gives you a sense of what happened to socialism in the West. The thesis of that book is that Marx's revolutionary dreams no longer apply. The success of the 1899, the success of the Social Democratic Party electorally and its ability to, through legislation, achieve a lot of reforms must make us believe that socialism will evolve from capitalism rather than being the result of an abrupt, violent revolutionary act. For example, in the US of A, in 1935, a senator from New York City, not Roosevelt, by the way, the senator from New York City, New York State, anybody? Robert F. Wagner. Are any of you from New York as natives? Well, if you were from New York as natives at your age, you would know who Robert F. Wagner was. He was a senator from this state until his retirement in the 50s. Robert F. Wagner, with the help of a communist lawyer, this is not part of the printed record. Robert F. Wagner, with the help of a communist lawyer named Lee Pressman, wrote, you know who he was, right?
The lawyer, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Wrote a piece of legislation that became known as the National Labor Relations Act, the NLRA. What he did was, write a bill that included an array of social benefits, refusing the one-by-one approach of most legislators in this country. Tax reform here, repeal the Affordable Care Act there. None of that. One bill included national health insurance, free medical care for everybody, unemployment benefits, workers' compensation. If you get hurt on the job, you're entitled to pay. Pensions, Social Security, which was called old age benefits. I'm old age, therefore I get the Social Security check every month. It's not enough to pay my rent. And one or two other things, about 5 or 6 pieces of
The shortened work week in that?
the shortened work week was not in
Later.
it
You go above black
because
later.
in 1932, a former member of the Ku Klux Klan, who had become a senator from Alabama. Who was that?
Hugo Black.
Hugo Black. Yeah, you're allowed to do that because
Thank
you're from
I lived
Louisiana.
close to him in Alexandria, Virginia, as a Supreme Court
So,
justice.
Hugo Black, a senator from Alabama, introduced the 30-hour week. And it passed the Senate and went to the House. And on its way to the House, 1933, first year of the Roosevelt administration, Roosevelt sent his Secretary of Labor, a woman, Frances Perkins, to the House to kill it. And in 1938, they passed a compromise bill of 40-hour work week. And Frances Perkins did as she was told. Roosevelt thought it would destroy his program of the National Industrial Relations Act, which was not the same as the National Labor Relations Act. The employers would not be ready for it. They would have massive lockouts of workers, and they would turn on the Roosevelt administration, and so it was not passed. But I'm talking about revisionism. As a result of that bill, which had everything but health insurance, that was cut out. There were people, especially Social Democrats, whether they were members of the Socialist Party or not, who thought that this was a step towards socialism. To its credit, the Communist Party disparaged such notions. It said that unless you begin to address the relations of production, unless you begin to address the fundamental laws of capitalism, i.e. the aim of production is profit, you will go nowhere. This is simply a redistribution of a lot of money, mostly from one section of the working class to another. That was their line. When Bernie Sanders, you've heard of him, was asked, what do you mean by socialism? During this last campaign, he named the New Deal. He didn't name it in that name. He named all the provisions of the New Deal of social benefits. That's all he meant by socialism. He was afraid to talk about expropriation. He was afraid to talk about the transformation of ownership, of profit, nothing of the kind. What we're facing with Sanders, you probably already know this, but I have to say it because it's in the context of revisionism, was the most ambitious revisionist program in West capitalist history. The idea that socialism was equal to social benefits, especially to the working class, including its poor segment, was a revisionist idea because it bypassed revolution, it bypassed the fundamental question of ownership and control, and it bypassed, to be sure, power. Roosevelt, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, George W. Bush, dare not mess with the welfare program of the Roosevelt administration because they knew very well how important it was for the maintenance of their constituency and for power itself. The left said nothing because they're so enamored with Sanders, who's basically a New Dealer circa 1935, absent the 30-hour week.
And the crumbs of social benefits. Right?
He didn't say anything. He doesn't say anything about hours. He didn't say anything about guaranteed.
No.
Oh, they had guaranteed income originally in the 35 was the that morphed into unemployment insurance. But in the history of the socialist movement, Bernstein was far more important because he set the line for the social democratic parties of Western Europe and the Socialist Party of the United States. When asked what he thought of the 36 election, the leader of the Socialist Party of the United States, Norman Thomas, said, "We were not surprised Roosevelt took our program, and that was the limit of the socialist program." I was a founder of one of the organizations that is now very active called Democratic Socialists of America. Irving Howe was a member of the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee, one of the two components of the merger that became DSA. Howe thought, and he wrote a book on it, on socialism, that socialism was an ideal. It had nothing to do with the forces of reality. It was essentially a matter of will. It was a voluntarist theory of socialism. Mike Harrington was much more sophisticated, but he was afraid to articulate all of what he believed because he was allied with Western Europe's social democrats. You know, the DSA is a member of the International Social Democratic movement. How do I know this about Mike Harrington? Of course, I used to talk to him. He was one of the negotiators for GSOC, and I was a negotiator for the New American Movement, and we had debated several times, and we knew each other as Mike and Stan, and we talked together over coffee. Of course, I'm still a Trotskyist, he said, in my heart. You know, I laughed at him. He said, no, don't do that. What is practical is social reform, not social revolution.
Say that again, Stanley?
What is practical is social reform, not social revolution.
That's what Harrington said.
Yeah.
That's the heart of revisionism.
Yeah.
It is.
Practice.
Bernstein.
Who was the first Lukács
The actual
translator?
rather than the classical.
How much attention did you pay to this? Maybe it wasn't.
And last week you mentioned it. You mentioned it last week.
Michael Harrington
Yes.
translated this very chapter of History and Class Consciousness from German to English when he was a member of the Independent Socialist League, which was a Trotskyist organization. He did this in the 50s. He came out in 57 in the New International, which was the ISL's American publication. Anything else you want to say? Yes.
Yeah, I don't know, you were talking, I guess, what you felt was maybe most important in this, and I guess I just,
I'm not finished, but go ahead.
yeah. Okay. Well, we were asking us, you know, back then, I'm just, suggesting that this passage at the bottom half of page 3, which is actually critical of, you know, Engels, and he says he contrasts the ways in which concepts are formed in dialectics as opposed to metaphysics. He stresses the fact that in dialectics the definite contours of concepts and the objects they represent are dissolved. Dialectics, he argues, is a continuous process of transition from one definition into another, and consequently one-sided and rigid causality must be replaced by interaction. But he does not even mention the most vital interaction, namely the dialectical relation between subject and object for the historical process, letting alone given the prominence it deserves. Yet without this factor, dialectics ceases to be revolutionary, despite attempts, illusory in the last analysis, to retain fluid concepts, for it implies a failure to recognize that in all metaphysics, the object remains untouched and unaltered, so that thought remains contemplative and fails to become practical, while for the dialectical method, the central problem is to change reality.
That was one reason he was thrown out.
Yeah.
Of course he died. But there was another part of this, which is elsewhere in Lukács. His criticism of Engels, which Engels of anti-Düring, is that Engels believed that dialectics was everything.
Sorry, dialectics was.
Engels believed that dialectics was in nature and society. And according to Lukács, dialectics is inherent in the relation of subject and object. In other words, in this book at least, he leaves nature to the scientists. That is to say, the bourgeois scientists,
Right.
and wants to confine dialectics to a method of understanding history and politics and political economy and so on, and identifies that with Marx, and thinks that Engels begins the process of the dilution of dialectics into what became Bernsteinism and his followers. But when we get to Adorno, we'll see something surprising. Just keep in mind that Adorno was a very sharp critic of Engels and a critic of Marx in some respects, but he was not a post-Marxist. I love the cat out of the bag. What Adorno does is declare that dialectics is in all things. All things includes nature. So it supports Engels, but doesn't go into it in any detail.
It's certainly much more sophisticated version of the social in Adorno than you have in Engels.
Sure.
Yeah.
Engels was a
You criticizing
textile
Engels?
manufacturer who supported Marx and popularized Marxism. Well, the popularization of Marxism was, to some extent, a major factor in its decline, because he was a dogmatist with a lot to say. That was important. Engels is a co-author of German ideology, for example. Now, what does this stuff mean?
We had a beer there, remember?
Sorry?
We had a beer where they wrote it.
What?
We had a beer in Manchester where they wrote it. Remember when we visited
You and I,
Peter?
yes.
We had a beer at the table. They didn't know who Frederick Engels was at the bar. They knew who Karl Marx was, but they didn't know who Frederick Engels was. They didn't know he was a native of Manchester.
The tavern
He popularized Marxism.
that they sat in.
That's right. It's funny. I said, where did Frederick Engels sit? Oh, I don't know who that is. Karl Marx was here.
Frederick Engels probably owned the lunchroom or the beer in the
The beer
bar
going,
that we
right.
sat in.
That's right.
Theory and practice.
Praxis.
Any comments? You read it. It's on page 3, I think.
Praxis.
Well, let me read it. The second complete paragraph on page 2. To be clear about the function of theory is also to understand its own basis, i.e., dialectical method. This point is absolutely crucial, and because it has been overlooked, much confusion has been introduced into discussion of dialectics. Engels' argument in the anti-theory decisively influenced the latest life of the theory. However, we regard them, whether we grant them classical status or whether we criticize them, deemed to be complete or even flawed, we must still agree that this aspect is nowhere true in them. That is to say, contrast the ways in which concepts are formed in dialectics as opposed to metaphysics. He stresses the fact that in dialectics, the definite contours of concepts and the objects they represent are dissolved. Dialectics, he argues, is a continuous process of transition from one definition into the other. In consequence, a one-sided and rigid causality must be replaced by interaction, but he does not even mention the most vital interaction, namely the dialectical relation between subject and object in the history of process, in the historical process, let alone give it the prominence it deserves. All right. What does the theory practice of dialectic really entail? That Engels was a contemplative theorist. If you read Engels carefully, that is a flawed view of Engels that Lukács has on the one hand. On the other hand, to include nature as subject to dialectical transformation is repelled but not refuted, except in one very basic phrase. the subject-object dialectic, which puts dialectics in the social process and not in nature, as they understood it. If you said that the hurricanes, typhoons, tsunamis, etc., that we've been suffering are really examples of the revenge of nature against its exploitation by human beings. If you say that, for Lukács's period, you're making a metaphysical, idealistic, metaphorical statement. But today that's not so distanced from what people believe, or could believe. That nature is an active living force. That it is not. Don't talk about concepts. That is not simply an it, a passive object to be appropriated for human purposes. When he goes to the subject-object relation as the heart of the dialectic, he is placing it in social relations and excluding nature on the one hand. On the other hand, if you regard nature as part of the subject-object dialectic, because it acts and has a history, then you might not be so far from Engels. And the secret I was about to say is that Adorno says in the theory, in the introduction to dialectics, that dialectics is quote unquote everywhere, means it's in nature. Putting him much closer on that question to Engels than he is to Lukács. He had a big fight with Lukács, Adorno. Lukács accused Adorno of now residing in the
Grand Hotel Abyss.
And the what?
Grand Hotel Abyss.
In the Grand Hotel Abyss.
After the movie with Grant Garbo,
right.
the abyssal plane of the, Adorno accused him of going back to his Hungarian mansion.
That's right.
Later. Both weren't exactly paupers or come from the working class.
The difference is, many of the differences between Lukács and the Frankfurt School are historical. That is to say, Lukács was born in 1885, Horkheimer in 1895. That's 10 years later. Marcuse in 1898, and Adorno in 1903. Lukács was old enough in his 30s to have participated in the one revolution beside the Bolshevik Revolution that came out of the First World War. Anybody know what that one is?
Bela Kun and the Hungarian
What?
Revolution.
The Hungarian Revolution under the leadership of the eternal Bela Kun, K-U-N. It lasted 133 days. You could figure it out. 31 days has a month. 4 times 33, 30 is 120. A little more than 4 months. And it was a revolution. It was a communist revolution. Kuhn turned out to be a loyal Bolshevik of a Stalinist variety. After the revolution was crushed, which it was, he went to the Soviet Union and became an official. Lukács had a much more checkered career, but he was old enough to be the Minister of Culture in the 133-day communist government. He also had written a pre-Marxist but piquant book, which I strongly recommend to anybody who wants to get into this more deeply. Theory of the Novel. Theory of the Novel was written published in 1911. This is published in 1923, History and Classical Consciousness. It's a collection of essays that begin about 1917, though.
Also, Soul and its Forms.
Soul and Forms is 1909.
Right, very early.
And Soul and Forms, not its, though it's Soul and Forms.
Okay.
It's 1909. 9 and 15 is 24. It's a lovely book. It's still an idealist book.
Right. No,
Yeah.
definitely.
Theory of the Novel is a transitional book. But they all, let us say the Frankfurt School, all attribute their critical theory. They don't use the word Marxism much. They attribute their critical theory of society, which is what the Institute for Social Research was all about, to inspiration of Lukács. Even though Lukács went to the Soviet Union and wrote on the novel that they would disagree with, they thought of this book and some other things, and Theory of the Novel, as extremely influential in their view. So we're not reading this as an example. He raises many of the powerful questions that needed to be raised, and Hegel and Marx have raised and have been suppressed or forgotten. One of which was revisionism as a concept. Because revisionism was and remains a hallmark of almost all Western communist and socialist parties. The revolutionaries, Marxists, are either relegated to small sects, or what is called in French groupuscules, or they form communist parties which are close to Stalin, but function inside their own countries as reformists or formations. Very important to understand. And the U.S. Communist Party was no different. There are many breaks in the history of the U.S. Communist Party with individuals and groups that call themselves revolutionary, and it proves the U.S. Communist Party of being revisionist. Names that you probably have never heard of, and I don't think it's because of a lack on your part, it's because the history is not there. You have to be a scholar of the subject matter to even come across those names. I haven't said this, but I think I am a scholar of the history of the U.S. Communist Party. One figure is John Karacher, who formed the Proletarian Party, the Revolutionary Communist Party, which was always a sect. But he had a kind of 1920s presence. Another was Francis Franklin, who was a left-wing figure, revolutionary communist who left the Communist Party in the late 1940s, right after the war. However, wrote articles and a book on the American Revolution, which was on the Communist Party line. The revolutionary book is called something about the American Revolution. It's got American Revolution in the title, I have it in mind. And it follows the line of the Communist Party, which was that the American Revolution was a democratic revolution. In part it was, but in many ways it wasn't. It doesn't mention, and hardly anybody else does, what was very big news during the revolution, which was that there was a big fight between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. In fact, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution were written to head off the Anti-Federalists. It was about the question of the central government. It was about the question of a tripartite governing group of which two parts, well, three parts, two parts completely, the Senate and the presidency were not result of democratic elections at all. They were chosen by delegated bodies. The Anti-Federalists, during the revolution, put out multiple pamphlets extolling the revolution and pushing the issues of popular democracy. The person who's told this story best, in my opinion, is an older book by Jackson Maine, which is a good book, M-A-I-N. And the person who's telling this book better is Joshua Miller, which is a book called The Anti-Federalists in the American Revolution. I think that's the name of the book. He teaches at Lafayette College. In Miller's account, Tom Paine, who the communists thought was a paragon of democratic virtue, is labeled a middle of the road, supported the main tenets of the Constitution and of the Articles of Federalism. It's very interesting. Any other points about this chapter that you found provocative? How is that possible? I'm going to have a final intervention if you don't say anything. Turn to page 10, please. The dialectical conception of totality seems to have put a great distance between the self and reality. It appears to construct reality very unscientifically, but it is the only method capable of understanding and reproducing reality. Concrete totality is therefore the category that governs reality. The rightness of this view only emerges with complete clarity when we direct our attention to the real material substratum of our method, viz. Capitalist society, with its internal antagonisms between the forces and the relations of production. The methodology of the natural sciences, which forms the methodological ideal of every fetishistic science and every kind of revisionism rejects the idea of contradiction and antagonism in its subject matter. If despite this contradictions do spring up between particular theories, this only proves that our knowledge is as yet imperfect. Contradictions between the theories show that these theories have reached their natural limits. They must therefore be transformed and subsumed under even wider theories in which the contradictions finally disappear. There are two ideas here which don't appear very much in the social democratic view, which is a dominant view, by the way, in the socialist in the world. Don't appear. One is, of course, absolute, the concept of the totality. What does Lukács mean by the totality? A collection of all of the factors? No. He doesn't make it all that clear, by the way, so that's why I'm here. He does that in the rest of the book. It's the, what?
The context.
Yeah, but it's got a specific version of the context. It's the subject and object. You know, Kant, Fichte, Locke, Berkeley, and Hume all had an ontological separation between the subject, which is consciousness, and the object, which is the social and natural world. He's arguing that they are part of the same world. That subject and object are part of a totality, which is a dialectical contradiction. To understand the totality, therefore, one of the things that you would have to do is renounce the exclusive reliance by many people who call themselves Marxists on political economy. That would describe 9/10 of all Marxists. I'm being generous to the 1/10. They think that the totality, if it exists, is really the economic relations of society, which are in Capital, volumes 1, 2, and 3, which are a critique of political economy. But they take political economy as an unavoidable and irrefutable fact, and the problem, therefore, is to find the correct political economic set of relations, in which the economic plays a dominant role. He is arguing for a concept of totality in which, if you interpret it as widely as possible, psychology, sociology, politics, economics, geography, are all part of the totality, but their relations can be summarized as subject-object relations. Geology is, but if you take the radical view, that would mean that any object becomes a subject under certain circumstances. Any object becomes a subject under certain circumstances. Nature is not itself a permanent object, radically separated from subjects. Subjects are not about consciousness alone. They're about social relations. You would agree with that. What we would, in order to evaluate the importance and the correctness of any socialist or communist movement anywhere in the world, to Lukács, one would have to evaluate the degree to which it has liberated itself from dogmatism and regarded the world as in its complexity, and understood that the various disciplines are only aspects of that totality. The question of nature, however, is still very controversial. And even if you took Lukács's line that the object is not nature, the object is social relations, and the subject is psychology, sociology, psychological and sociological phenomena, you have a much more complicated view of the world than political economists, who call themselves Marxists. Yeah.
Where would you go with, like, Jason Moore's thoughts around the social relations being part of nature?
I think that's a very provocative idea. He's not the originator of that idea, but it's a very good idea.
Okay.
I mean, I said Adorno called himself part of nature. And if we think of ourselves as minds or supra beings to nature, we're making a profound error. What's more controversial is to ask the question about nature. But the dialectical question about social relations is complex enough to detain people for the time being. The concept of the totality implies that subject and object, however you define object, are all part of the same reality. That they are not, their materials are not fundamentally different. That we could become objects, and do become objects, under certain circumstances, was the whole project of the Frankfurt School, of Marcuse, of Horkheimer, and Adorno. They wanted us to recover our status as subjects, that is, as people who make reality, as well as being subject to reality, to a reality that we don't make.
I have a question. In this, I'm understanding everything you're saying. I'm wondering if in this concept of totality, the notion of potentiality is also included. Because a lot of this is sort of a read of history and the way that we've sort of come to be where we are through the relationships of the subject to the object and these sorts of transformations. But it seems that also the potential for the future should be referenced in this notion of totality. Is that possible?
Sure.
Is that contained here as well?
Sure. I mean, one of the more controversial parts of Marxism is the designation of the proletariat, of the working classes, as subjects of history that are incontrovertibly going to dominate the future.
Mm-hmm.
That is not a silly question anymore. There are many people who know their stuff who say, and I'm not going to argue this right now because we're going to be arguing this over and over again when we do this, but who say that may have once been the case, that capitalism won that war and has dispersed the proletariat. Not primarily through outsourcing, but primarily through technological change. We have a working class now, industrial working class, I'm not talking about the broader definition, which is about 40% of what it was in 1960. And with all prognostications that I have been able to gather, it will be 20% by 2025. and so on. Not that it's being transferred to China or transferred to Vietnam, but that technology produces goods without the apparent intervention, except at the level of design, on human labor. Whether we need a radical revision of historical materialism will be continually taken up in this class, and I would expect more people to participate. I know this is only the second time. So let me just say one more thing. And, I gotta say two more things. The second one, besides the notion of totality, is the notion of contradiction. Why? Many liberal social scientists will not only acknowledge but celebrate the existence of conflict and differences within capitalist society. What they do not agree with is that all things within, at least social things, are characterized by contradictions, the resolution of which does not settle issues, but creates new ones. So the contradiction implies change. Conflict does not necessarily imply change. Antagonism means a zero-sum game. Conflict does not. We can resolve conflict by sitting down and making a deal. We can't resolve contradictions by making deals.
Mm-hmm.
All right, this is what's going to happen for next week. Read the forward to the 5th edition, if it's in your copy. But certainly the dialectical contradiction is, read the first two, read the forward to the 5th edition and the first two parts of the dialectical contradiction, which are titled A Critique of Hegel's Dialectic and Historical Materialism. That'll bring you up to page 78, plus 6 will be 84.
In what?
But that's a short reading.
Lefebvre's dialectical material.
What?
He's moving from the first object of their
preface.
investigation
Did
is
say
dialectical
that.
contradiction.
So the first
He
78
did say that.
pages
He said
in
for next
Lefebvre.
week. in
Bring the
Lefebvre.
first 84 pages.
In
plus-
Henri
The
Lefebvre,
first, how many pages?
1939 course book for the
84?
Communist Party of
You
France.
You got it.
Called
Anyway.
Dialectical Materialism. 1 through 84.
The edition that's in
Bring
print
your,
is
books. Bring your books. It's
Yeah,
the
University of
old form. This is
Minnesota.
the old form.
That's the old Cape Town. That's a
Does
beautiful
anybody have a
That's the one
copy
I
of the
have.
new?
Yes,
I have
great.
this one.
I have all the Levy's
No,
Strauss.
next week.
Wonderful
I
stuff.
have the new one.
Yeah.
The library
And
had the new
These
one.
were great publications. Pocket books, yeah.
Be prepared, everyone, to raise questions.
Yes, sir.
Raise questions either of seeking knowledge or raise questions about whether you think this stuff is full of shit, okay?
Okay.
Either one. Okay, good.
By the way, just to extend what you were talking about in terms of the political economist, in your second to last book that was published, the life and death of American labor,
Yeah.
your chapter on the ideology of economic determinism critiques this very version of people look at that, which is
Okay.
a way in which you actually demystify, and you go back to a kind of sense.
The Life and Death of American Labor was published by
that place in London, Versa.
No, sorry, no.
Versa.
Jason
Versa.
Versa.
Yeah, the American version.
What chapter, Michael?
It's